harsh winter of 1847, the town of Millbrook, Kentucky, uncovered a secret that would haunt the Ohio River Valley for generations. Beneath the esteemed Sullivan Medical Institute authorities found a hidden network of chambers containing the preserved remains of over 60 individuals, men, women, and children, who had mysteriously vanished from the surrounding community over the past 15 years. Detailed surgical notes in Dr. Cornelius Sullivan's precise handwriting revealed procedures so extreme that no ethical physician would have dared to perform them on living patients. What horrified investigators most wasn't just the brutal nature of the experiments, but that most victims had originally sought treatment for minor conditions like headaches, insomnia, and stomach discomfort, ailments that should never have warranted such radical interventions. Though a full report was compiled, the Kentucky State Medical Board swiftly buried the findings, locking away the truth for nearly 2 centuries. Before this grim revelation, the name Sullivan had symbolized healing in Millbrook since the town's founding in 1823. Nestled along a quiet bend in the Ohio River, Millbrook thrived on tobacco grain and steamboat commerce. By 1832, it boasted nearly 800 residents, farmers, merchants, and river workers who took pride in their brick courthouse towering Methodist church, and most of all, the Sullivan Medical Institute. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan had arrived in 1831, a dignified man in his early 40s, with silver-streaked hair and an air of educated refinement. Claiming credentials from elite schools in Philadelphia and Edinburgh, he brought with him an impressive array of surgical instruments and rare medical texts. In just months, he had established a grand 3-story brick institute on Main Street, featuring private rooms, a state-of-the-art surgical theater, and a basement laboratory. The townspeople admired his modern approach to medicine, eschewing outdated bloodletting in favor of revolutionary treatments focused on anatomy and neural science. His methods yielded astonishing results. Chronic pain vanished. Mental illness stabilized, mysterious afflictions resolved. Sullivan lived quietly above the institute with his teenage daughter Margaret, a reclusive girl who assisted in treatments and avoided public gatherings. He often spoke of his late wife lost to yellow fever in New Orleans and the tragedy that fueled his devotion to medical science. No one in Millbrook questioned why so many of his miraculous recoveries involved drifters, out-of-town patients, and individuals with no local ties. People whose disappearances might go unnoticed. Suspicion first stirred in October 1846, when Thomas Hicks, a prominent tobacco merchant, reported that his brother Robert had been missing for over a month. Robert, recovering from a riding accident, had entered the institute for what was supposed to be a 2-week treatment. Every inquiry was met with vague reassurances from Dr. Sullivan, who claimed that isolation was essential to Robert's recovery. Frustrated, Thomas turned to Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael, a practical man with long-standing ties to the community. On a gray November morning, Carmichael paid an unannounced visit to the institute. Dr. Sullivan welcomed him with polite professionalism, insisting that Robert was too delicate for visitors. Yet the sheriff noticed something unsettling. Margaret, mopping near the basement stairs with water tinged a rusty brown, and the unmistakable odor of decay seeping through the floorboards despite the harsh scent of lye. That night, driven by unease, Carmichael returned alone. Circling the building, he found a basement window with a narrow view inside. What he witnessed would scar him for life. Dr. Sullivan, clad in a blood-stained apron, stood over a table making incisions into what appeared to be human flesh. The room was filled with jars of preserved organs, anatomical sketches, and rows of tables, each with a sheet-draped body. Among them, the sheriff recognized the red hair and stocky frame of Robert Hicks. When word spread, the town's reaction was hesitant and conflicted. Instead of immediate outrage, many questioned Carmichael's motives, defending the doctor who had saved so many lives. Rumors swirled Thomas Hicks had turned to drink, some said, and Carmichael had long harbored resentment over Sullivan's criticism during a recent cholera outbreak. Dr. Sullivan, calm and composed before the town council, claimed that he was conducting legitimate research using cadavers legally obtained from Louisville, and that Robert had tragically died of brain fever despite exhaustive efforts. But even as he spoke, the truth lay buried beneath the institute, preserved in silence, awaiting the day it would resurface. Dr. Sullivan claimed he had preserved Robert Hendrick's body while hoping for a breakthrough that might one day save others, admitting he delayed informing the family in case progress could be made. Addressing the town council, he spoke with heavy sorrow, assuring them that every procedure he conducted served a higher purpose, the advancement of medical knowledge. If his methods seemed extreme, he argued it was only because traditional medicine had failed too often. The council, swayed by his reputation and confident demeanor, voted to let him continue practicing under closer oversight, requiring detailed records of all patients. His willingness to cooperate reassured most residents, but Sheriff Carmichael remained unconvinced. He had seen too much and quietly launched his own investigation. Over several months, he uncovered a pattern the town had overlooked. Between 1832 and 1846, 37 patients were admitted for extended treatment, only 14 ever returned. The remaining 23 were reported as deceased, but most came from distant counties or were transient laborers whose deaths were conveyed through letters to families unlikely to visit. Further investigation revealed that Sullivan had been ordering an unusually large volume of anatomy books, surgical tools, and exotic medical supplies from institutions in Louisville, Cincinnati, and Baltimore. His financial records showed regular payments to untraceable suppliers, labeled simply as research materials and anatomical specimens. More alarming still, Carmichael discovered advertisements in regional newspapers targeting individuals with chronic or untreatable conditions, urging them to seek revolutionary therapies at Sullivan's well-equipped facility. As winter deepened in 1847, families began appearing in Millbrook, each with a hauntingly similar tale. Their loved ones had traveled to the Sullivan Institute seeking treatment and never returned. Samuel Turner, a riverboat captain from Indiana, had sent his son David in 1845 for treatment of depression after a tragic loss. After one letter dictated to Dr. Sullivan and claims of progress, all contact ceased. Turner visited Millbrook repeatedly, each time receiving vague reassurances or forgeries letters that looked nothing like his son's handwriting. Eventually, Sullivan claimed David had been transferred to a facility in Louisville, but no hospital there had any record of him. In Bardstown, Mrs. Eleanor Dawson entrusted her daughter Catherine to Sullivan's care after a traumatic incident left her with fainting spells and headaches. Catherine wrote 2 letters describing her recovery and new fascination with anatomy, even suggesting she might become the doctor's assistant. But her mother knew this was impossible. Catherine had always fainted at the sight of blood. Then silence. Dozens of similar stories emerged. Each began with hope, continued with staged updates, and ended with a sudden disappearance explained away with death or mysterious transfers to unnamed facilities. Carmichael saw the pattern clearly. Sullivan preyed on the desperate and the distant patients, whose families couldn't visit often and whose absence wouldn't raise local alarm. But the sheriff suspected the truth ran even deeper. What he had glimpsed through that basement window was only a fragment. The institute was massive, with ample space for concealed activities, and Margaret Sullivan, the doctor's enigmatic daughter, seemed to be more involved than anyone realized. Convinced that the institute housed secrets darker than any had imagined, Carmichael prepared for a final, thorough investigation. On a bitter February night, he returned to the building accompanied by Deputy James Whitfield and Dr. Augustus Brennan, a retired Army surgeon who had voiced private concerns about Sullivan's practices. They waited until midnight, when the institute lay still and dark, save for the faint glow of the basement lights. Using a key obtained from the building's original contractor, they entered through the rear service door into a narrow hallway leading to the main floor examination rooms. The moment they stepped inside, all three men felt something was deeply, unnervingly wrong. The moment they entered the institute, a wave of chemicals hit them. Formaldehyde laced with something rotting and unmistakably human. The wooden floors bore dark stains that had been scrubbed but never fully cleaned. From somewhere below, faint sounds rose: the clink of glass, the scrape of metal, and murmured voices too low to understand, but undeniably human. Dr. Brennan inspected several first-floor rooms and found them outfitted not for healing, but for confinement. Iron manacles were bolted to the walls, windows secured with exterior-only locks, and the beds fitted with heavy leather straps meant to hold patients immobile. "These aren't treatment rooms," he muttered grimly. "They're prison cells." In Sullivan's office, Sheriff Carmichael located a locked cabinet stuffed with patient files, meticulous records that revealed the full extent of the physician's twisted experiments. Each file detailed not only symptoms and treatments, but also anatomical sketches, bone measurements, and descriptions of surgical procedures ranging from organ removal to what Sullivan called cerebral mapping experiments conducted while patients were still conscious. The file for Robert Harris contained 17 pages documenting how Sullivan stimulated different regions of the brain and recorded the resulting pain responses and behavioral changes, crafting a disturbingly methodical map of human consciousness. But it was the file labeled Primary Research Assistant Subject M that exposed the most horrifying secret. Unlike any other, this one documented procedures not on a patient, but on Margaret Sullivan, the doctor's own daughter. According to his notes, Margaret had been his ongoing experiment since arriving in Millbrook. The pale, silent girl the townspeople believed was helping with his practice had in reality been systematically modified. Sketches showed the surgical scars on her body, lists of drugs and experimental compounds administered to test her resilience, and plans for neurological alterations meant to create a human subject tailored for Sullivan's research. She wasn't just an assistant. She was his most refined creation. Behind a bookcase in the office, Deputy Whitfield discovered a concealed staircase leading down into the basement. The deeper they descended, the thicker the chemical fumes became. The sounds below grew: sharper metal tools, footsteps, something being moved. What awaited them was worse than any of the men had imagined. The entire basement had been converted into a multi-room laboratory. In the central chamber, 4 surgical tables were arranged under harsh lamps, each fitted with restraints and surrounded by shelves of preserved organs. Walls displayed anatomical charts covered in notations, each body mapped and divided with a surgeon's precision. In the preservation room, Carmichael counted 43 jars filled with human organs suspended in cloudy solutions. Each was labeled with a date and patient initials, forming a grotesque archive of over a decade of secret surgeries. Some jars held entire limbs. Others contained dissected organs laid bare for study. The labels showed that these specimens had been harvested not post-mortem, but from living subjects. Yet nothing matched the horror of Sullivan's neurological research chamber. 12 human heads were preserved in large glass vessels, their features intact. Next to each floated a chart documenting how Sullivan had accessed different regions of the brain. Several faces were recognizable: David Turner's cleft chin, Catherine Dawson's dark curls matching the missing persons whose families had pleaded for answers. Dr. Brennan was examining a surgical chart when footsteps echoed from the staircase. Turning toward the sound, the 3 men saw her. Sullivan descending slowly, oil lamp in hand, the same blood-stained leather apron clinging to him as when Carmichael had first spied him through the window. Behind him, Margaret followed her movements, stiff and unnatural like a puppet on strings, proof that her father's alterations had gone deeper than flesh. "Gentlemen, I must say I'm disappointed." Sullivan announced calmly, placing the lamp on the table. I had hoped Sheriff Carmichael's curiosity could be resolved through more conventional channels. But it seems we've reached a point where direct intervention is necessary. Margaret stepped in front of the stairway, blocking any chance of retreat. Her movements were smooth but disturbingly unnatural, as if every motion required conscious control. Meanwhile, Dr. Sullivan continued speaking in the same calm, clinical tone he used with patients upstairs. I imagine you're feeling the usual reactions: shock, disgust, moral outrage, he said, his voice steady. But everything you see here serves a greater purpose. These sacrifices, however painful, will one day eliminate suffering for countless others. Sheriff Carmichael's eyes drifted to a nearby table, where a surgical array had been carefully prepared. Scalpels, bone saws, clamps, and bizarre tools that no reputable physician would recognize. It was clear Sullivan had been readying for another procedure before they arrived. These people came to you for help, Deputy Whitfield said, his voice firm despite the overwhelming horror. They trusted you. Sullivan's face brightened with something like joy. And what a rare gift that trust was. Do you know how hard it is to find willing participants in truly revolutionary research? Cadavers offer nothing, just cold, unresponsive flesh. But my patients, they offered life. The chance to study anatomy and neurology in real time. He walked to a jar containing a preserved organ, admiration in his eyes. This liver came from a farmer with chronic fatigue. While conscious, he allowed me to explore hepatic function and its correlation to energy levels. His contribution to science vastly outweighed anything he might have accomplished in the fields. Dr. Brennan, visibly struggling to remain composed, took a step forward. This isn't research. It's torture. These people suffered. Sullivan turned toward him with an air of superiority. You've seen trauma, doctor, but you've never studied it. Pain is merely a neurological signal. With the right approach, it can be modified or eliminated entirely. Watch. At his signal, Margaret rolled up her sleeve, exposing a series of surgical scars. With chilling detachment, Sullivan took a scalpel and made a shallow cut along an existing wound. Margaret didn't flinch. Her face remained serene, her eyes calm. Through nerve pathway modification and targeted chemical treatment, Sullivan explained, Margaret no longer feels pain, yet she retains full cognitive function. She's my finest achievement, an assistant immune to the emotional constraints that plague ordinary minds. In an eerily tranquil voice, Margaret added, The procedures were unpleasant at first, but Father said temporary discomfort was necessary. Now I assist without emotional interference. It allows for purer research. Sheriff Carmichael's stomach turned. Margaret wasn't simply a withdrawn girl. She was a victim of her father's long-term experimentation, her humanity surgically stripped away in service of his obsession. Sullivan's voice grew more animated. Margaret is only the beginning. I've discovered techniques to eliminate fear, sorrow, even empathy, while enhancing tolerance and efficiency. Imagine what medicine could become without the chaos of emotion. He moved toward another section of the lab, revealing more examination tables. Sleek mechanized platforms equipped with restraints and advanced monitoring devices. David Turner was instrumental. He said, consulting a journal thick with notes. His melancholia offered a window into the brain's emotional architecture. By isolating and modifying the neural pathways responsible for persistent sadness, I developed a method to remove depressive responses entirely. His tone carried the pride of a man presenting a breakthrough, utterly blind to the monstrous cost. You mean you performed brain surgery on a conscious patient? Dr. Brennan asked, his voice tight with fury. I prefer the term neurological optimization, Sullivan replied smoothly. And yes, Consciousness was essential. Without it, how could I measure emotional changes in real time? David was remarkably cooperative. He offered feedback throughout the procedures, helping me chart emotional response to surgical intervention. His contributions to neuroscience were extraordinary. While Sullivan spoke, Deputy Whitfield had been quietly inspecting the lab. In a corner partially hidden by hanging curtains, he found something that made his stomach drop. "Sheriff," he called quietly, "you need to see this." Behind the curtain was a hidden chamber housing 6 patients alive, restrained and in various stages of surgical experimentation. Their heads were shaved in patches, fresh incisions covered by bandages. Each was strapped to a table, eyes wide and tracking movement, but unable to speak. Their terror was unmistakable, even if they couldn't scream. Sullivan followed their discovery and beamed with pride. "Ah, my current research subjects, each one undergoing a unique protocol to study consciousness, pain perception, and behavioral control. That gentleman there suffered from chronic insomnia. I've been modifying his sleep regulation centers to determine if sleep can be made obsolete. Promising results so far, though some cognitive side effects have emerged." The man tried to speak, producing only strained, garbled sounds. His vocal cords had been damaged. This young woman, Sullivan, continued gesturing to another table, sought help for anxiety. "I'm testing surgical interventions on the amygdala to eliminate fear while preserving other emotional functions. Several rounds of procedures have been necessary, but we're close to success." Sheriff Carmichael's blood ran cold. These weren't preserved remains or historical victims. They were living subjects enduring active, ongoing torture under the guise of research. Margaret moved among them, adjusting restraints and checking instruments with the cold efficiency of someone utterly detached from human suffering. Whatever empathy she once had was gone, surgically erased. "Margaret is essential to my work," Sullivan explained. "She monitors vitals, maintains surgical sites, assists in extended operations, and none of it is clouded by emotional interference. She represents the next generation of medicine physicians driven purely by progress, not sentiment." Dr. Brennan stepped toward a young woman whose eyes begged for rescue. She was in her early 20s, her once delicate features disfigured by surgical scars. The chart hanging at her bedside read Subject N61. Catherine. Her initial complaint had been migraines. Catherine's case, Sullivan explained, has provided valuable insights into pain localization and management. By altering different neural pathways, I've isolated the roots of chronic pain. Her sacrifices will improve treatment for thousands. Catherine's eyes were fully aware. She could see, hear, and understand, but her body no longer obeyed her. Sullivan had stolen not just her voice, but her autonomy. Brennan's hands clenched in helpless anger. "How long have they been here?" he demanded. Sullivan consulted his journal, smiling. "Catherine has been with us nearly 8 months. A long-term subject allows for layered study. I've mapped shifts in personality and cognition as I modified targeted areas of her brain. The data is unprecedented." Sheriff Carmichael turned away, barely able to contain the sickness rising in his gut. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't even murder. What he was witnessing was something colder, methodical, clinical evil, masquerading as progress. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan wasn't healing anyone. He was dismantling them, piece by piece. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan had been keeping his patients alive for extended periods, systematically dismantling their brains while ensuring they remained conscious, trapped in bodies that no longer functioned, yet fully aware of their suffering. As he selected surgical instruments with calm deliberation, he turned his attention to his new audience. "The 3 of you," he mused, "represent fascinating research opportunities." His eyes settled on Sheriff Carmichael first. Your background in leadership and moral reasoning makes you ideal for studying the neurological foundations of authority. I've long theorized that decision-making could be enhanced surgically if one could remove moral hesitation from the equation. He moved toward Deputy Whitfield with the detachment of a scientist evaluating lab specimens. Your physical conditioning and stress resilience suggest you'd be a prime candidate for studies in pain threshold reconfiguration and behavior control under duress. When Dr. Brennan instinctively stepped back, he found his escape route blocked by Margaret, her movements methodical, her training unmistakable. "And you," Dr. Sullivan said almost warmly, "your military experience makes you invaluable. Imagine battlefield medics impervious to the trauma they witness. Surgeons who never falter, never hesitate, free from sympathy, fear, or emotional distraction. That is the future I'm building." Sullivan envisioned a medical world shaped in his image, one where empathy was surgically erased and all decisions were made in the name of progress, regardless of cost. But as he approached with his tools, the facade of scientific genius collapsed into something far darker. When Sheriff Carmichael attempted to break for the exit, Margaret reacted with lethal efficiency, wielding surgical tools as weapons with the same cold precision she applied in procedures. It became painfully clear she had been trained not only to assist in operations, but to defend the laboratory against any threat. She fought like a machine, fast calculated, devoid of emotion. Dr. Brennan managed to free Catherine from her restraints, but Sullivan's experiments had stripped her of normal motor control. Though fully conscious and aware, she couldn't move with coordination, another victim trapped inside a broken shell. As the confrontation escalated, Sullivan fought back with desperation, all while continuing to articulate his theories and methods. Even as he was physically restrained, he ranted about the ungrateful ignorance of those who couldn't see the brilliance of his work. "You're destroying 15 years of unprecedented research," he shouted, as Deputy Whitfield secured the restraints. "These subjects have advanced our understanding of the human brain in ways your limited minds could never grasp. Future generations will vindicate my work." Margaret required separate containment. Even then, she remained eerily calm, assessing, analyzing, already mentally organizing her father's procedures from memory. Sullivan had succeeded in remaking her into the perfect assistant. No fear, no rage, no grief. Just a mind conditioned for obedience and scientific focus. Her blank expression, as she watched the laboratory fall, was more disturbing than any outburst could have been. The dismantling of the Sullivan Medical Institute required a coordinated response from local authorities. State officials, federal marshals, and a team of forensic medical experts. The scope of the operation stunned even seasoned investigators. Among those brought in was Dr. Marcus Fitzgerald, a renowned neurologist from the University of Louisville, who spent 3 weeks studying Sullivan's journals and procedures. His preliminary findings described the work as a grotesque fusion of advanced medical knowledge and absolute ethical collapse, a systematic assault on human consciousness disguised as science. The final victim count reached 89. They ranged in age from 14 to 67, hailing from across Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Illinois, and Virginia. Sullivan's newspaper ads had cast a wide net, drawing patients from distant towns where oversight was minimal and disappearances could be explained away. His records traced a disturbing evolution. What began as unconventional but legitimate treatments in the early years had spiraled into scientific sadism. With each successful operation, Sullivan pushed the limits, further perfecting procedures that allowed him to preserve consciousness while destroying autonomy. He built an entire infrastructure around deception, forged letters to families, faked updates, and a meticulous system for managing bodies when patients died mid-experiment. In the end, Sullivan hadn't simply betrayed the trust of those who came to him for healing. He had redefined cruelty, transforming medicine into a tool of torment, cloaked in the language of progress. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan's crimes were not the work of a madman acting on impulse. They were the product of cold, methodical intelligence. His operation was a calculated system supported by years of planning, logistics, and deception. Of the 6 patients found alive in his laboratory, only 3 survived long enough to receive medical attention. Their injuries were too severe for recovery, but their testimonies revealed the full extent of the atrocities he had committed. Catherine Morrison, a young woman who had originally sought treatment for migraine headaches, survived 6 weeks after her rescue. During her lucid periods, she recorded chilling notes detailing the months of conscious surgeries she endured. Sullivan, she wrote, would cut into her skull while she remained awake, probing regions of her brain while lecturing about perception and pain. When she cried or begged him to stop, he chastised her, claiming her emotional reactions disrupted scientific progress. He insisted the agony was a small price for discoveries that would help humanity. Catherine's testimony, later preserved in court records, became the most detailed first-person account of Sullivan's procedures, describing his use of chemical sedatives to paralyze the body but preserve awareness, ensuring his victims could not resist, only endure. Thomas Beckwith, a 34-year-old miller from Brandenburg, who had come to Sullivan for chronic back pain, survived with partial cognitive function. His statement described how Sullivan had promised to eliminate his pain through targeted neurological modification, but instead spent months systematically damaging his nervous system to study how the brain processed sensation. Each surgery, Sullivan claimed, would be the last. But there was always another theory, another nerve to explore. Beckwith realized too late that Sullivan had never intended to cure anything. He was only ever interested in what the body could teach him as it broke. 17-year-old Elizabeth Harden from Owensboro was brought by her parents to seek help for melancholic episodes. Her testimony exposed one of Sullivan's darkest obsessions, experiments on younger patients whose resilient brains could endure more trauma. Elizabeth described watching Sullivan operate on others while explaining his theory that emotions like fear and sorrow were neurological flaws to be corrected. He believed he could engineer human beings who never experienced pain, doubt, or despair. The perfect citizen, the perfect assistant. The most complex case, however, was Margaret Sullivan. According to the findings of Dr. Marcus Fitzgerald, a neurologist from the University of Louisville, Margaret had been subjected to invasive brain surgery since childhood. Her father had not only used her as an assistant, but as his longest-standing experimental subject. Miss Sullivan represents the most extensive case of deliberate neurological modification ever documented, Fitzgerald told the court. Her emotional and moral faculties had been systematically removed, leaving behind only cold intelligence and procedural precision. Margaret's own testimony confirmed this, delivered with unshaken calm. Father began modifying my neurological responses when I was approximately 8, she stated. Initial procedures focused on pain and anxiety reduction. Later interventions addressed emotional reactions that interfered with scientific objectivity, sympathy, empathy, moral judgment. She spoke without hesitation of restraining patients, monitoring their vitals during prolonged surgeries, and assisting with the disposal of bodies. For Margaret, these were routine duties in the service of science, not crimes. The legal proceedings against Dr. Sullivan lasted 8 months. The court struggled to define his actions within existing criminal law as his methods combined elements of medical practice, psychological manipulation, and prolonged premeditated violence. The defense argued that Sullivan was not a murderer, but a researcher whose judgment had become warped by obsession. They claimed he had pursued knowledge, not cruelty. Sullivan, for his part, remained defiant. On the stand, he used the opportunity to justify his research, explaining his experiments in exacting detail and expressing open frustration that legal authorities lacked the vision to understand his work. These individuals advanced our understanding of the brain beyond anything modern medicine has achieved, he said in his closing remarks. Their suffering was a necessary investment in the future. One day science will prove me right. The jury disagreed. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan was convicted on 87 counts of first-degree murder, making his trial one of the most extensive serial murder cases in American legal history. The judge sentenced him to death. While awaiting execution, Sullivan composed a 400-page memoir in meticulous handwriting, detailing every facet of his research procedures and philosophy. The memoir became yet another piece of evidence, unapologetic and unhinged, showing his descent from ambitious physician to clinical sadist. His records included financial ledgers that tracked payments to chemical suppliers, surgical instrument dealers, and regional contacts who helped maintain his operation. Some of these suppliers investigators discovered had sent Sullivan substances and devices unusual for a rural doctor, raising questions about whether they had known or at least suspected the truth. More disturbingly, Sullivan's correspondence revealed that he had been selectively sharing data with medical researchers across the country, sanitized findings stripped of their unethical origins. Though none of his peers knew the full extent of his methods, some may have accepted his results without asking hard questions. In that way, the reach of his crimes extended beyond Millbrook, casting a long, silent shadow across the medical community. Dr. Sullivan died by execution. His victims, silenced and disfigured by the pursuit of knowledge, without conscience, were finally buried with dignity. But his work, his journals, procedures, and Margaret's surviving knowledge remained locked away in state archives, sealed under court order. Whether future generations will open those files remains a question for another day. And when they do, the true legacy of the Sullivan Medical Institute may yet rise again. Though Dr. Cornelius Sullivan was ultimately brought to justice, his crimes did not exist in isolation. Some of his private letters revealed a disturbing possibility. Other physicians were conducting similar experiments. The implications forced federal authorities to broaden their investigation, uncovering a hidden web of medical malpractice and unauthorized human experimentation that had quietly taken root under the guise of professional respectability. Among those implicated was Dr. Edmund Forrester of Nashville, who had been in frequent correspondence with Sullivan. He had purchased similar laboratory equipment and chemical supplies. And when his practice was searched, authorities discovered preserved human organs and surgical notes. The findings suggested not only unauthorized post-mortem examinations, but also the possibility of experimental procedures performed on living patients. In Lexington, Dr. William Chandler had received detailed letters from Sullivan discussing techniques for neurological modification. His patient files revealed a troubling pattern, an unusually high number of fatalities among individuals treated for minor conditions. His practice was shut down, pending a full inquiry, but Chandler died of a heart attack before he could be charged. The most unsettling case emerged in Louisville, where Dr. Harrison Blackstone operated a private hospital that specialized in mental and neurological disorders. He too had exchanged letters with Sullivan discussing surgical methods to optimize brain function. Though Blackstone maintained the appearance of legitimacy, further investigation revealed that many of his patients had undergone multiple surgical procedures, often unrelated to their original diagnoses. His mortality rate remained within acceptable limits, and he regularly sent reassuring letters to families. But his case files reflected an unmistakable pattern, experimental research masquerading as treatment. These revelations suggested Sullivan's operation had not been an isolated anomaly. It was part of a broader, shadowy movement, physicians exploiting their positions to conduct unauthorized and often unethical human experimentation. Though the full extent of this medical underworld was never fully uncovered, the findings pointed to a troubling reality. The misuse of scientific ambition was more widespread than anyone had imagined. Margaret Sullivan, The most complex and tragic legacy of her father's work was committed to the Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane. Their medical professionals attempted to understand and undo the extensive neurological modifications performed on her since childhood. According to Dr. Samuel Patterson, the hospital's director, her condition defied traditional diagnoses. Miss Sullivan possesses intact memory and cognitive function. Even medical expertise, he reported, but shows no evidence of normal emotional understanding. She cannot process empathy, guilt, or remorse, only procedural logic. Margaret lived until 1903, never regaining emotional awareness. Though incapable of forming human connections, she occasionally provided insights into brain function that proved useful to researchers. Her case became a landmark in early neurological literature, a study in both the advancement of neuroscience and the devastating cost of ethical collapse. She stood as both a medical resource and a warning, a living reminder of what science becomes when severed from morality. In March 1847, the Sullivan Medical Institute was destroyed by fire. Locals said the flames burned in unnatural hues fueled by the chemical preservatives used in the laboratory. The smoke was so toxic that the entire town of Millbrook had to evacuate. But even the fire couldn't erase the institute completely. Sullivan's chemical processes had poisoned the soil, halting plant growth and creating a persistent health hazard. Eventually, the town declared the land permanently uninhabitable. No structure would ever rise on that ground again. For the families of Sullivan's victims, the nightmare didn't end with his execution. His meticulous record-keeping meant they were forced to confront in vivid clinical detail what their loved ones had endured. Page after page revealed surgical procedures, physical degradation, and prolonged suffering, all conducted under the pretense of treatment. The emotional weight of this knowledge proved too much for many. Dozens of families relocated, unable to remain in towns where neighbors had once defended the man who tortured their children's spouses and siblings. The scandal surrounding Dr. Sullivan cast a long, dark shadow over the Ohio River Valley. It reshaped public trust in the medical profession, prompted the reevaluation of ethical standards, and forced institutions to confront the ease with which science could become a tool for horror. What began as one man's obsession ended as a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and the human cost of knowledge pursued without conscience. And though the Institute is gone, its legacy endures in medical journals, in sealed archives, and in the quiet places where no flowers grow. Samuel Turner, the riverboat captain whose son David perished under Dr. Sullivan's scalpel, spent the rest of his life fighting for change. Haunted by his loss, he testified before the Kentucky legislature, helping to spearhead new laws for medical oversight and patient protection. My son trusted Dr. Sullivan, Turner told lawmakers, because he was desperate and because this community placed blind faith in a man's credentials and reputation. We must ensure no other families suffer because physicians are allowed to operate without oversight or accountability. His advocacy led to real reform. In the aftermath of the trial, the Kentucky State Medical Board implemented sweeping new regulations. No experimental medical procedures could be conducted without formal approval from a medical review board, and all patient deaths under treatment had to be reported. These standards would become a model for other states and help shape the foundation of modern medical ethics and research oversight. Yet for more than a century, the full contents of Sullivan's journals remained sealed in state archives. Officials feared that releasing the details could inspire copycat crimes or provide dangerous blueprints for unscrupulous physicians. Sullivan's techniques, while abhorrent, had revealed insights into neurology that modern medicine wasn't yet ready to confront. And so the true extent of his work was buried alongside the victims he had mutilated in the name of science. The town of Millbrook never recovered. The scandal tainted its name beyond redemption. Businesses shuttered, families moved away, and by 1860, Main Street was little more than a ghost town. The site of the former Sullivan Medical Institute remained untouched. Repeated attempts to remediate the soil failed, nothing would grow. The land was discolored, animals avoided it, and locals whispered of strange odors, inexplicable sounds, and a suffocating sense of unease. Whether psychological trauma or something more, the legacy of Sullivan's crimes lingered in the earth itself. Folklore took root. People spoke of lights flickering where the laboratory once stood, of voices heard in the wind, and of dreams filled with screams. No building was ever erected on that ground again. It was as if the town itself refused to let the horrors be forgotten. The Sullivan case exposed how easily medical authorities' social status and geographic isolation could be weaponized into a tool of prolonged, systematic evil. He exploited the hope of desperate families, the slow communication of the 1840s, and a lack of professional oversight. His trusted position shielded him from suspicion, making it nearly impossible for families to question his actions without casting doubt on an institution the community revered. In that environment, suspicion became heresy, and concern became silence. Medical historians still study the case today. It became one of the earliest and most disturbing examples of how unchecked power in the hands of a trusted professional could lead to horrific abuse. The fallout helped birth the principles we now take for granted: informed consent, peer review, institutional accountability, and ethical standards in human research. Sullivan's trial also gave rise to one of the earliest psychological profiles of a criminal who maintained social respectability while engaging in serial abuse, helping lay the groundwork for criminology and forensic psychology. His story is a chilling reminder that professional titles and community standing do not equal moral integrity. Oversight exists for a reason: to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit trust for personal gain. It reminds us that blind reverence for authority can be dangerous, especially when those in power operate without consequence. But perhaps the most disturbing question remains unanswered. Was Sullivan truly acting alone? His letters suggest otherwise. Other physicians received his correspondence, implemented elements of his techniques, and maintained unusually high mortality rates. While some were caught, how many slipped through unnoticed? How many quietly continued similar experiments, hidden behind closed doors, protected by the same trust that once shielded Sullivan? What do you think? Was everything uncovered, or did Sullivan's legacy live on in secret? Could there be others who studied his work and continued it under new names in new places? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share your theories on this disturbing chapter in American medical history. If this tale chilled you, subscribe for more dark historical mysteries. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode, and as always, thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.